So hopefully you've all gotten some food. hopefully, oh, sorry, okay. Okay, we're here in August. It's been forever since I've seen you all. I'm sorry I missed our last meeting. So I'm so happy to be here today for our 8th meeting already. So we are going to quickly go through our housekeeping items and then get to the good stuff that you're all waiting for. So I just wanted to remind you about our agenda today. We will quickly go through the housekeeping items, and then we will be going into, and I think this is actually might be a slightly old, but I think we're going to do some cost data first, and then we're going to hear from Beam. Keith came all the way to see you all in person again. And then we're going to hear about the public outreach results. And then we have 40 minutes to talk through today. Really, we're trying to get you the data we know that you'll need in order to make a recommendation to the staff and the Board of County Commissioners in a bridge option to move forward. We know that there might be additional data that you all need, so we want to collect that so that hopefully we can come back next week with that data. And then eventually, by the 15th, we'll make a decision on what to move forward. So that's our plan. Really, it's starting the tough conversations and the hard work to try to narrow down from 6-ish to 1. So that's what we're intending to do today and Thursday. So just really briefly, if there is an emergency, we can exit out that door or we can exit out these doors. The restrooms are across the hall. Please feel free to get up as normal and exit as you need. There's coffee and tea in the back, so please stay awake. I don't think you'll fall asleep, but you know. We are still streaming this live onto YouTube, and we want to make sure everyone can hear properly. You do have mics. The mics with the cords, please don't take out of the holders because they make noise, right? And then, but please try to make sure that you're speaking into the mic when you're speaking so that people online can hear us. If you have any problems hearing us, let us know. This is our first time in this space, so we just want to make sure it works all right. You can see here on the slide our meeting protocols that we've been using lately, and the main thing, you all know this because you're pros, is just put your table 10 up if you have a question. We'll have lots of conversation later tonight, and so I want to make sure that I get to you all and get your questions answered. I think the next slide is you all. Thank you all for being here. And then the next one, cost data. Before we get into that, I just wanted to remind you all, you have several things printed in front of you. The agenda is there on top. Then you have a very large stack of slides. So you can reference those as we go through the presentation. We also have our guiding principles. So if you remember way back when we went through this, I want to just reference these really quickly. And so basically, this is just a reminder to take some time to review these principles in your evaluations as we go through this conversation today, particularly urban and site context, user experience on the deck, and visual character and aesthetics. So Carol Mayer-Reed will talk about these a little bit more in our next week meeting so that we can just bring it back to these items that you all spent so much time on earlier. And then just really talking about how this relates, how these principles relate. But they're here. Take a look and use them as you want. All right, so I think I'm going to hand it off to Emily to talk about cost. And so just to reframe for you all, this is our time to bring you some data that will help you in your task, really, remember, as the Community Design Advisory Group to bring all this information together to help you make a recommendation in the final bridge type selection. So we're trying to bring you everything we think you'll need to feel empowered to make a decision. So I'm going to hand it off to Emily. Okay.
Okay, can everyone hear me all right? Yeah, great. Little, if I get, okay. It's as close as I can get without putting it in my mouth. So, in case you all are as bad as names as I am, I'm Emily Militich. I'm our construction phase project manager for the county. So first off, I think we just wanted to say that we're really excited to have you all here and kick off this part of the process and really start to hear from you all about what you think. So we heard through both some public comments and from you all that having some more detail on some of the cost data would be helpful in your discussions and the way that you think about the various bridge alternatives that are in front of you. So this slide is really meant to just sort of put on a scale all of the different 6 options to take a look at kind of how they relate to one another. So the costs here that are shown are really the differences between the various options. So the 3 that show the kind of $0 million, it's not free, unfortunately. But those are sort of the lowest cost options. So that's the goalpost tower for the cable stay, and then the brace basket handle and the brace vertical arch for the two types there. And then each of the other options you can think of them as additional costs above the least expensive option. So you've got your V tower that's sitting between $20 and $30 million in addition to that lowest cost. Our inverted Y that's right around the $45 million mark, and then our unbraced through arch that's about the $50 million mark. And I just wanted to remind everyone also that of all of the options that Beam produced, our design team produced, we ran those through a screening criteria that included cost, looking at schedule, looking at constructability, risks, and impacts to the public. And all of these met those criteria. And those criteria were really meant for us to kind of bracket what we could fund, what we think we could reasonably build. So all of these options are on the table. The county feels like all of these are within the fundable range, but we just heard that having this data might be useful for all of your conversations. So that's really the intent here, but all of these are acceptable options for the county. And then in addition to this, as Brandy mentioned, we'll also get some input from Beam, and then we'll get the summary of the public input that we've had over the last month. So this is just one piece of your puzzle to look at. Any questions about this? Yeah.
There were a couple different versions of some of these, the tied arch bridges that were longer. Should we add another X million to those longer options to consider that longer span, just as a rule of thumb? Is there a way for us to gauge where they would land on this scale?
Yeah, so of the 2 longer options, there was the basket handle and then the braced arch. There was no longer option for the unbraced arch, and those are sitting around the kind of $30-ish million extra mark.
Thank you.
Yep.
Awesome. I think I saw Jason next.
Yeah, can you just remind us of what we're looking at in terms of the base cost so we're understanding the delta in relationship to the overall cost, please?
Yeah, so we have kind of the initial costs that we developed as part of the environmental review study. We've had our contractor go through and kind of do really high-level estimates on the various alternatives, but we're not going to get a really good cost that we can share until we've actually done our type selection and done some of those design refinements. So right now we don't have a new cost to share, but that's something that would absolutely come with our 30% design development this fall.
Okay, I think Aaron might have something to chime in on that, and then Valerie, and then Gwen.
As a follow-up, can you give us a ballpark within, say, $50 million of what the baseline cost would be, just so we could have some sense? I mean, just saying there's no number. I know we've talked about a number previously. Maybe you could just tell us what the old number was?
Yeah, so right now the total cost of the project is sitting right around the $900 million mark. For construction costs, that was built up to that 900, that was sitting around the $600 million mark.
Okay, Valerie.
Yes, hello. I was curious because even though knowing the $900 million amount, these still seem to be wildly different costs from one another, like such as between the goalpost tower and the V tower. And I wondered if there was more information on the variance in cost between, for example, the goalpost and the V tower.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. I think all of the previous presentations are available. Is that right, Brandy? So we did sort of go through each of them and kind of what led to the higher costs and what makes something easier to build, what makes something more difficult to build. Specifically for the V tower and the goalposts, just having those inclined towers alone, in part, is what makes it more difficult. There's longer schedule implications, which just means the entire team is out there longer, which costs additional money. And there's just kind of those nuances with each of the various options. So the more, let's say, standard, the construction is, the kind of easier, the less expensive it is. And then as soon as you start kind of adding things that are different, or you have to, you can't have like really repetitive construction processes as you go along, it makes it more expensive.
Does that answer your question, Valerie?
It does.
Okay. Gwen, did you still have a question? Okay. All right. Anyone else have a question for Emily? Okay. You can always ask her something later. We'll have plenty of time today. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. So Keith is going to present now. This is our second set of data. So we know you all had lots of questions for Keith in previous meetings. And so we just wanted to make sure that he had an opportunity to talk with you all. So I'm going to hand it over to Keith.
The dreaded blue screen. All right, so I'm going to express my opinion. My opinions don't necessarily reflect everybody's opinions in the team, but I can only speak to my discipline. Next slide. So the task is trying to get some clear water between these 6 generic types. Yeah, I'm not going to eat it, Cassie. I don't want to sort of start on a kind of denial, but just so you're aware, my company, designed one only of this 6, but had we designed them, because generically we would have come to the same conclusions. The other thing I want to say is that these are generic. These are not designed, these haven't been given the love. These are to try and differentiate between type. So there's a long way to go in the design, and whichever one comes out on top of this game will be better than you see it on the screen. So next slide. I mean, there are 6, but actually generically there are 2 types, and if one were to break it down, to try and differentiate between whether it's an arch or a cable stay, as opposed to which arch and which cable stay. So I just want to run through some differences. Next slide. Okay, well, that's not the slide I have in front of me. So, yeah, could you go back one, please? That's okay. Well, subjective or objective? I mean, I suppose that subjective is what your gut tells you, and the objective. Well, I can put it this way: it's what I tell you, I guess, because there's a there's a lot of complexity that goes into designing something like this that doesn't come out in pictures. So I suppose if I would phrase it like this, that not to choose entirely from the pictures. Next slide. So here's a question. Let me tell you the answer to this. Yes. Right, and this is what I mean by about being objective, because subjectivity tells you that inherently people do prefer arches. Next slide. I know this because I've designed a lot of bridges and I've designed a lot of arch bridges, and there's a kind of formulation to if the public are involved, there's a kind of 3-to-1 ratio of preference. I know I don't know what the public public vote would have been, but I'm guessing I could have saved the county a lot of money by telling you that it would be a 3-to-1 vote. It may not be, but that's what I'm predicting, that there would be a slight preference. And I'll tell you why. Next slide. There's a general perception that there's a sort of anthropomorphic thing about arches. They are they're curved. Everyone loves a curve. I won't ask you to choose which Coke bottle you are, but I'm on the right hand side of the scale, not in a good way. They're comfortable insofar as they're not challenging because we all know what an arch looks like, and from that point they're recognizable. They're common, by which I mean they are everywhere. So they're not distinctive in the sense that if you build an arch over the I-5, people in the other side of the planet will say, "Oh, that's the Burnside Bridge in Portland," because it's an arch. And they're also perceived to be historic, which they are, of course. The Romans weren't shy of an arch, but what I don't think that means is that they're historic in terms of context. They're not the natural fit to every historic scenario. Next slide. So everyone loves an arch. I love an arch, but are they the right answer to every situation? I would say they're not. Whether they're the right situation here depends on many other factors. Next slide. So just in terms of comparison, an arch would be typical because an arch is an arch. An arch requires 2 springing points. It's got to land on both sides of the arc, and it has an arc in between them. But a cable stay bridge in this scenario would not be typical because most cable stay bridges are like the Tillicum. They have 2 sets of towers. Next slide. So here's a typical arch, and here is a typical cable stay, but we don't have that. Next. We have this. And that immediately creates a distinction in terms of a bridge on this site and a bridge on any other site, because the main span is on one half and the back span holds the main span up. So, there's immediately a kind of rise in the distinctiveness of a cable-stayed bridge in that scenario. They're not very common single tower scenarios. Next. The other thing I would say is that there's a great difference between the two, without any bias to one or the other, but there's a great difference in the visual field. So an arch is end to end. You get a very palpable sense of what it is, whereas the cable-stayed bridge, yes, it has cables, but its main visual focus is on the tower. So it's a visual punctuation. There's a great difference in the visual mass between the two things. Next slide. Well, there you go. I mean, it's the difference between, it sounds negative, the common form and the uncommon form. Next slide. So there's something curious. We've talked a lot about the celery stick, right? This idea that you have one bridge, but you also simultaneously have three bridges. And on the east side, that bridge has one job to do, which is crossing the I-5 railroad corridor, which you see in red. But as a quirk of this situation, because you can't put your feet down on the east side of the Willamette because of the ground condition, that arc spans over river as well. So you get that kind of curio where it's doing a bigger job functionally than it is necessary for it to do. Next slide. So I've already talked about the sort of visual difference in that punctuation on the cable stay, but one is visually heavy, or at least relatively, and the other one is visually light, relatively, because there's a great difference between a 10-foot wide steel arch and a 6-inch diameter cable or a 9-inch diameter cable. So that area of the river is spanned by something with a visual determination at the top and a visual shyness at the bottom. Next slide. Now, if I were to leave now, I've got to the point where I think this is the most important slide that I will show you. So that's the difference. You get on the right-hand side of the screen there, between the cable stay at the bottom and the arch at the top, you get a very, very different visual impact between the two. I'll just mention in passing that we are doing a lot of work on the shaping and demeanor of the bascule chambers, those big concrete in-water piers. That this is where we are at the moment. Not all of the images you see will reflect that, but this is where we're going. And if I were to use a phrase, our job, I think, is these are big things, and the visual impact of these is major. So our job is to tame those visually, give them manners. So next slide. So just to concentrate on the arch for a moment, you get this slightly disconnected superstructure coming in from the east and landing on the pier. Next slide. And what that seems to me, at least, is that you get these things, you wonder what they're doing, and they're kind of charging over from the land and hitting the water. It's like a photo bomb. You get a slight feeling that the thing that's coming in from the east probably shouldn't be there. Next slide. So in your deliberations, I just want to sort of put this plea to say, yes, your gut will tell you something, but all of these structures were largely the top two were supposed to be temporary, but there was an outcry when they were built, and there was an outcry when they tried to take them away, because this thing's 120-year life at least, this bridge, and times change. In fact, time changes everything. The two bridges at the bottom were not popular, but are now obviously national treasures in their nations. So it's a kind of warning to me as much as you to say sometimes you have to think forwards as well as backwards. Next slide. So just a few things on. I'll do the arches first, and then I'll do the cable stays. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about the shaping of the arch, I'm going to talk about the material, I'm going to talk about the construction. We've talked about this before, so there shouldn't be too many surprises, but we'll see. Next slide. This is not what it will be. So this is a bridge that we designed in Washington, D.C. It's painted steel, it's longitudinally welded, so it's seamless. And as you can see on the top left there, it's got this quite distinctive shape that changes over the length of it, so that we're playing with, it does that for structural reasons. It's only It's only fat where it needs to be, and it's slender where it needs to be. But that shaping does an awful lot for the visual perception. Next slide. Here's another example. This one's in the UK. I think you can see on the right there the way that the light and the shadow work on that. You know, these are important aspects. So that arch is shaped like a kite. Next slide. There's a worry here, right? Is that in the US you don't have a mature welding culture. You bolt things together with splice plates. We have a weathering steel arch here. I think that's the right decision, but it's a decision that doesn't come alone, and we can debate that. But you know, if the devil is in the detail, you know, there's a worry that the arch in your mind is not the arch that's going to be spanning that obstacle. Next slide. So there are lots of examples, some of them good, some of them not as good. I mean, here are your types. There's 4 because 3 doesn't fit very well nicely on a divided screen, but there is a future discussion about the bracing. So the bottom 2 are, top right and bottom left are braced, but braced in different ways, and we'll come back to that. But you can see on all of those, actually, well, perhaps with the exception of the one on the bottom left, that they're all bolted. And the reason for that is because the one on the bottom left is not in the US. Next. So when you add up the material and the construction methodology, you get what I might refer to as an industrial aesthetic. And that may be something that you want. My opinion is that some of the great bridges, I mean, particularly the steel bridge, which is a kind of engineering powerhouse, is of its time. And to build a new bridge that is not of its time is not doing justice to the site and the time in which you're building on that site. So there's a kind of plea for sophistication, I think. Next slide. Okay, I'll gloss over this quickly, but just to say that it's a big structure. The one on the right there, he's not a very small man. It's quite just a big arch. That is the bridge in Washington. But the box structures, we will have a box structure, which means that you need man access inside of it, which is one good reason that it needs to be weathering steel. You know, and that needs to be accessible, maintainable. Next slide. But it's possible in some of these arch scenarios that we might be able to dispense with the idea of a box and go with a girder structure. You know, that might sound like a downward step. I think it's probably a positive step, because if you have a girder, you've already got this level of articulation, which I think is enjoyable. So you don't need to start trying to change the box and try and get some joy out of the box. You get part of that joy out of the girder. So there are good examples and there are less good examples, but you know, we can work towards that. Next slide. Just some things on weathering steel. Weathering steel's it's a matte surface, so it's very difficult to remove graffiti on. We've been arguing about this today, and we will be arguing about it till kingdom come. But my contention is that it's more difficult to effectively remove graffiti from weathering steel than it is from concrete, in particular, which the cable-stayed tower would be, or painted steel. The other thing is lighting. So there's very low absorbent or reflectivity, high absorbency, low reflectivity. So if you think I want an arch because I'm going to get this great arc of light in the sky, probably not. There's also a climbing risk. That's the bridge in Washington on the right-hand side. That chap stayed up there for 2 days, which was a bit of a feat. Next slide. And there is a climbing issue. Part of my job is to get rid of stuff, right? You know, the less stuff you have, the better. But I think in this case, because that arch reaches over and lands on the in-water pier, that there's almost no choice but to start sort of caging that end. So that, you know, we'll be adding stuff, not subtracting stuff. Okay, next slide. So there are 3 types, as you know. Next slide. I'll just make 1 or 2 points on this. You've already heard that there's a sort of cost. You know, this is rather typical. Is that the simpler things are, quite often, the more expensive they are, because it takes a great deal of effort to make, you know, to take enough stuff away for them to be elemental and simple. I'm rather keen on this in the arches. I think this is the best of those, but the cost of that is literally cost, and part of that reason is that you've got 2 arches that are standing up on their own. They're not braced, so laterally, sideways, they have to be quite stiff. So they're bigger. They're bigger than the arch ribs in the other 2 types. Next slide. Well, look, the one on the left is a throwback, and I don't want to dwell on this, but these are both braced arches. One braces against the other arch, and the other one not so much. It's braced via the medium of some cross bracing. And you know, there's a great difference in the simplicity of those things. But you know, were we to, this is a question of evolution, right? Is that were we to choose the one on the right, I think we would try and make it more like the one on the left, to take things away and make it simpler and better. I think we can, but we might not be able to get back to where we were. But just to tell you that when you have bracing, it's all about the bracing aesthetically. So next slide. So when you get to this point, it's only about the bracing. You know, the thing that I'm looking at is the cross brace. I mean, I quite like it. It's a sort of girdle kind of thing, but you know, there are lots of iterations of this, and I can't tell you the number of hours of my life that I won't get back in cross bracing studies. So this is where we're at. My opinion is that this is probably the least, well, I'll put it this way, it's the most common, and therefore the one that I'm least interested in, because I think this site deserves something that is above the baseline. Next. All right, so I need to explain my numbering here, because everyone that's looked at this has questioned me. So everyone has said, are the marks at the bottom out of 6? And I say, no, they're out of 3, right? So the Olympics are on. This is my gold, silver, and bronze. But I'm not giving a gold medal, because I think that the unbraced arches and the basket handle arches are equally good, but equally challenged. I think they could be both made better. So they get silver medals. I think the braced arch doesn't get a place on the podium at all. So that's 5th out of 3. I'm not going to read the words, but you know, there's. You know, there are positives and there are less positives for each of those. And you have the slide, so I would encourage you to read those words afterwards, because there's another slide equally for the cable-stayed bridges, and those 2 slides are my opinion. So, I said which one was the most important slide, but add these 2 to that list. Next. All right, the same on cable-stayed bridges. Next slide. Again, we'll talk about shaping, material, and construction. Next slide. Okay, so this is a bridge we designed recently that you can't see it, but this is effectively the equivalent of the goalpost scenario that you have here. But you can see that the kind of the love has gone not into the overall shaping, but in the detail of the shaping. And I think the simpler the form, the more important that is on a cable-stayed tower. Next slide. Here's another one, and I mean, the words say it really. Faceted forms just really affect the way that the light falls across a plane, and it really makes a huge difference to the slenderness. So the towers you have seen on our 3 options are not shaped. And whether they will be shaped is a question of constructability, cost, and other aspects of it. But there's a hierarchy of necessity, and the necessity is greater, for example, on the goalposts than it is for the others. Next slide. Okay, this is the Tappan Zee Bridge over the Hudson, where we're talking about that exact same thing. It's vertical tapering, migrating seams. Maybe the form against the skyline at the top of the tower will make a huge difference to the final outcome. Next slide. Well, a little bit about constructability. I mean, both the V tower and the inverted Y tower come at a cost premium relative to the others, but there's a coefficient between cost and value. In my opinion, the value of doing something that is, well, let's say doing something that isn't the goalposts, the value is very high. And the reason that cost is in there is mostly because inclined structure is more complicated to do than vertical structure. Next slide. Okay, so we have our 3 types. Next slide. So this is what I mean by the requirement for shaping. So that's the Golden Ears Bridge on the left-hand side. I don't know which one the one on the right is. But you can see that these are square section extruded up vertically. No taper, no shaped cap, no nothing. And I think that they suffer from it. But I mean, interestingly, it's really easy to understand why they're like that, because the construction is so much simpler. Because if you extrude a shape up through, and you don't have to change your formwork or any such, it's very efficient, very cost efficient. Which is why you saw that the goalpost, which was reflecting an unshaped tower, was at the left-hand side of the cost matrix. Next slide. Well, so there is the Tappan Zee, and it you can see that it tapers, and you can see that it has a shaped top. But interestingly, both this one and the next one need less shaping, because at the macro scale they already have visual interest because of their overall shape. Next slide. And here is the inverted Y. I just like what the one point on this is that we're calling it an inverted Y because it starts with 2 legs and goes to 1, but that's only above the deck. Below the deck, it cuts back in. There's a very different experience below and above, and there's not really any point where you're seeing the thing as a whole. The Tillicum out here, I very much enjoyed coming here because you get snippets of that bridge. There are places where you can see the whole thing, but it's more about the snippet views. I think we'll be the same at Burnside. Of the 3, this has the most interesting shape without being shaped in detail. Next slide. So here's my 1, 2, 3, which turns out to be 1, 3, and 5, because I think from an architectural point of view, I think there is clear water between those. If I start on the left-hand side, I don't think the goalpost is, I mean, it's clean and it's 2 sticks rather than 1 stick, but it's not novel even in Portland. and I've used the rather bold word boring. I mean, someone else might call it simple, but I think it offers less than the site deserves, is my opinion. The other two, well, I mean, it could be 1 and 2. I just happen to think that the inclined tower is not an urban, the V tower is not an urban form per se. I think it's doing something against the grain of the buildings that I find slightly uncomfortable. I think it's perhaps a bit self-confident. It's coming from me. Which puts from an architectural point of view, at least, the inverted Y tower as a clear favourite. Next slide. So, in terms of preference, I'm pretty clear. I think that the goalposts and the braced arches are not enough for this important site. And I've already told you what my preference is, which puts the other ones as less preferred. I don't know whether that's a negative or more preferred than the ones that are not preferred, but less preferred than the one that is preferred. You could think about that for a while. Next slide. So I'll reiterate the words at the top. This is the preference of BEAM architects, which may not reflect the preference of my sponsors. I quite like this slide because, and I think this is one of the several reasons that we prefer this, is that view, which occupies the gap between the yard and MLK5, is a country mile better than the response of all of the other types. Next slide. So, I might read out some of these. Is that, I think it's an urban and an urbane solution. I think it's quite sophisticated, and I think it's quite modern. I think it's a sort of 21st century solution rather than a 19th century solution. It doesn't have that industrial aesthetic, and unlike all of the arches, it doesn't photobomb the river, which is important, I believe. I think it has the best ride-through experience. I think the last image demonstrates that. I think it's pretty unique in Pacific Northwest. I mean, it's pretty unique anywhere. So to go back to that idea about 1 tower rather than 2, I can't think of another one anywhere. And when it comes down to it, I don't think it's reliant on complex shaping. So the overage might narrow. I do have to say, I think it's pretty, it's over robust in the way that it's been represented currently, and will get better, like all of the others will get better. Next slide. Okay, so I mentioned earlier the shaping on the in-water piers, so this is not a true representation of where we are at, but I do think it just gives you a kind of clear narrative about the individuality of the East Bridge and the continuity of the deck as it runs through. So your eye is going in the horizontal line, not as it would in an arch along the horizontal line to the far pier and then up and over the arc of an arch bridge. This is a very clear difference. That probably is my last slide. No, it's not. I'm going to remind you. Next slide. Just a reminder, okay? This is the most important slide. And I know the next one is the end because I've written the words "the end" on the next slide. So we better go to that one. There are some more slides. When you have Q&A, the comparative views that you saw the last time are available, but I'm not going to talk to them.
So we have a few minutes for questions, if you have some questions for Keith. Otherwise, we can move on to hear some more data from the public survey, and then we can always have conversation. So I see Bob, and then, oh, sorry, Patty. I'm not sure who went first, but we'll go Bob and then Patty.
Keith, a point of clarification for my needs. Is there any, beyond the visual part of the end slide that you shared, does the cable stayed versus the arch have a different relationship to the bascule component in the middle? And that's a leading question because I believe the cable stayed will have less of an impact than the arch in terms of bearing.
Yes, but not that should affect your decision. I mean, there are spatial as well as structural differences because obviously you've got a bit of structure coming down, and you have to sidestep it with your bike path and your footway. So the spatial condition is different because you've got less stuff coming down onto you've got a cable instead of a 10-foot wide arch rib coming down onto the deck. And well, they're both tied back through the deck, but yeah. So there is, but I don't think it's a determining factor.
Okay, great. Patty?
Thank you.
You'll need to get closer to the microphone, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In preparation for this, I went through the guiding principles again, and there are two important omissions, and I think we ought to address them at this stage. One is to do with the west end of the bridge. As I recall, in the early meetings, we all agreed that we should not crowd the historic buildings on the west side. They're 75 feet tall, and we agreed we shouldn't crowd them. What I heard at one of the public meetings was that it was actually a requirement of NEPA that we not have anything above the structure of the bridge, bridge deck. I don't recall that. That may be the case, but it's not clear from the design principles whether we can in fact have structure above. I believe we could. I believe we could have structure above the western part of the bridge without crowding the historic buildings. And I think we may have been led to the stick of celery somewhat wrongly. So that's. I don't expect you to respond immediately to that. Unless you want to respond immediately to that.
Yeah, yeah, I can just clarify. So in our engagement with the National Park Service, who does have permitting jurisdiction over the Skidmore Old Town neighborhood, which is on the National Historic Register, they did state strongly that they would not be able to permit a bridge with structure above the deck because it would impact views both into and out of the district. And so that is why during NEPA we ended up with the structure you see here, which is a low profile structure, just girders underneath supporting the bridge.
Okay, thank you. The second omission is to do with pedestrian access. There is no pedestrian access to or from the East Side Esplanade, or more importantly, from Waterfront Park. I know it's been raised before, but there still is none. And approaching the bridge on foot, if you approach from the east side, you walk a full 6 city blocks before you have any opportunity to get off the sidewalk. That's a long way on foot. And if you're actually going to the Waterfront Park, you walk 8 blocks to get there. I really think that somehow we need to have the convenience in Portland of all places for pedestrians to get to and from both the East Side Esplanade and the park directly from the bridge on a staircase. This does not necessarily go against ACHD rules, but I think it's essential in this community that we have proper pedestrian access. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Patty.
Thank you, Keith, for the very educational and insightful presentation. I have a question regarding the inverted Y or any of the cable stayed. What's the size of these posts that we're talking? Because the tied arches, you said, was a 10-foot kind of width by whatever z-axis dimension. I was curious what the cable stayed. How large are these posts in kind of profile?
Yes. No, it's an excellent question, Brian. And you know, in full disclosure, I don't. Although I ought to know, I don't know the answer to that currently. Well, I don't recall the answer to that. But much as in the arch for maintenance, there's man access up through it. You know, it's a hollow vessel. I think we were somewhere around 16 feet as far. Do you know that?
About 20 by 60.
Yeah. Okay. 20 by 16. So in itself, it's a bigger element, but it's a vertical element rather than a quasi-horizontal element. So there's a difference in the visual impact of those two things.
Thank you.
Do you want me to try it? Okay. Maybe one last. Oh, Gwen. Okay. Did you go first, Gwen? No. And then Gabriel.
Gonna make John work this big room today. Thank you for that presentation. I thought that was very informative. And I guess I wanted to say I agree that the industrial aesthetic is one that I feel like we can move away from. I feel like the neighborhood that this bridge is landing in is changing rapidly before our eyes and moving away from factories to other things. And so I want to remind people, and I think that showing the tied arches where we don't have a welding culture here in the States, I guess, all of those rivets and plates and things like that do show up, and they show up for pedestrians and bicyclists in particular. You will notice those things in that first 30 feet that you can see from where you're walking, and you will see that, and they won't look as smooth as they do in the renderings. So people should keep in mind all the things that get glued onto these bridges as they get built. I also want to concur with Patty that there's a lot of disappointment that I'm feeling about the not being able to connect to the Esplanade or Waterfront Park. And I got an explanation at the OMSI event because I couldn't believe my ears when I heard that myself, that there's an ADA ramping problem and that there may also be seismic issues with having something abutting the bridge. But those are solvable problems. So it would be, and I know that the city has put their feet in the mud about elevators. It would be good to see if we can't work this problem. I feel like it's a great missed opportunity to not connect to both Waterfront Park and the Esplanade, which are two crown jewels of public access to the water in Portland. So as you move forward with this project, it's nothing to do with the bridge type, but it has everything to do with making this bridge knit into our city. Finally, I just want to, I appreciate actually hearing your opinion. I'm sure some people might say, like, well, why are we getting your opinion now? And aren't we supposed to decide? And I want to honor expertise. I think we hire experts to design things for us for a reason. And, we do have this open and public process in Portland, and I think that's important. And I think people need to be heard and to weigh in and to have this transparency. But there's an expert in the room, and I appreciate you sharing what you're seeing, coming with fresh eyes to our city. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Gabriel, do you want to say?
Just generally, when you're dealing with the inverted Y tower, you said it's a 20 by 16 strut going up. Is that going to need to maintain at a doubled width when it gets to the connecting points, or can you thin that out so it would only be 20 by 16 in the middle instead of 20 by 32?
Yes, yeah, exactly so. But when it meets in the middle, that's the kind of business end, because then you've got cables coming in that need to be anchored inside. So, there's a lot of spatial work to be done to work out what that size would be comfortably. But yeah, it's not 20 by 32.
Yeah.
No.
All right, so our last data set is Sarah is going to present about what we heard from the public over the last month of outreach. And so again, this is something that we, discussed, you all discussed at the last meeting of what was going out to the public. And so we want to share the results of all that outreach. All right, Sarah.
Also, we do have a survey analytical expert in the room, Brenda right over there. So if you have questions that are beyond my expertise, we do have somebody in the room who can answer a little bit more. But let's first get into our summer outreach activities. So I think some of you know that we held a number of activities during the survey that was open from July 1st to July 31st. It just closed last night at midnight. So here's a couple of pictures from all of the events that we had this summer. Next slide, please. And then here's also a snapshot of just our reach. You can see the thousands of views and responses that we had, and I'll get into the survey data in a little bit. But we also held a number of briefings. We worked with DEI organizations throughout this input process. We held breakfast on the bridge, which was super fun. We had a couple of folks from this group that came out. 50 plus people showed up to that. And if you're not familiar with what that was, we basically had breakfast on the bridge, and we had some of our consulting team providing basically the basics on how to take the survey. We had people actually taking it on iPads right as we were having breakfast, so it was pretty great. It was another way to reach the community. And then our big kind of heavy hitter event was OMSI, where we had a night out with the Burnside Bridge team. Thank you so much to Carol for helping coordinate that, and Gwen for sitting on the panel, which was super fun. Next slide, please. And then here's a couple of pictures from that event. We had really great questions that came from the community. A number of folks were actually from the Burnside skate park who had some really important questions about the future of the skate park. Next slide. And then we also reached out just to make sure that we were diverse in our reach. We worked with community engagement liaisons. So these are people that have rapport within different language and ethnic communities. And we asked the same survey questions in these focus groups that we did on the survey. We also translated the survey into 7 different languages other than English. Next slide. Okay, so let's get into some of the data. I'm sure you guys are interested in this. Next slide. So again, you see the survey and how long it was open. We had more than 119,000 views of the online open house and survey site. More than 19,000 surveys were submitted. Pretty excited about that number. And more than 300 in-language surveys. So that's all of the other languages other than English. And then 73% of those who took the survey said that they lived in Multnomah County. And they had to put in a zip code for that. Next slide. All right, so let's get into also some of the demographics of those who actually responded to the survey. So 78% of respondents, and you do have this in your packets if you want to look at some of the numbers closer. 78% of respondents identified as white Caucasian. A little more than 5% of respondents identified as Hispanic Latino. Nearly 5% identified as Asian, and nearly 2% African American, Black. And again, you do have all the numbers in front of you. Next slide. And then let's also talk about age. So this was pretty encouraging for our project team to see. So 29% of respondents were between the ages of 35 and 44. That was the largest percentage. 25% were between 25 and 34. And then a little more than 17% were ages 45 to 54. And something really important to note here is historically we've seen older communities that usually participate in surveys like this. So we were pretty encouraged to see these numbers with the younger generations participating. Next slide. And then gender, it's pretty close. So nearly 46% identified as male and 43% identified as female. And then smaller percentages identified as non-binary or would rather not say. Next slide. Okay, so let's get into the bridge type specific data. Really close here. So 54% of respondents preferred tied arch and 45% of respondents preferred cable stay. Another important piece to note here is that more than 80% of survey respondents only chose to provide input on their preferred bridge type. So I'm not sure if y'all remember, but when we were talking about the survey, they could go and say, hey, okay, I like the tied arch, but let me put some input in about the cable stay. 80% of those people said, no, I just want to say what I want to about the one that I prefer. Next slide. Okay, so let's get into tied arch specific survey results. Next slide. So we're comparing just the number one votes. So if you remember, they can rank all of these sub options, like 1 through 3 for each, right? 3 and 3. And this is just the number one votes. So for tied arch, the braced basket handle and the unbraced vertical arch were very close, within 50. And then respondents, let me just get my notes here. And then fewer respondents preferred the braced vertical arch. And again, you can see all of those numbers right there. So pretty close between those two, the braced basket and the vertical arch. Next slide. So here are some of the key themes. So reasons why people chose tied arch. Uniqueness. So many people said that they noted that we already have a cable stay Tillicum Bridge in downtown, and they wish for something more unique. Many respondents also talked about style. They preferred the tied arch because they think it's more aesthetically pleasing and more timeless than the modern cable stay. Context was another key theme. Many respondents felt the tied arch fits better in the context of its surroundings, like the east side buildings, skyline, or generally just ties in better with the city. Some respondents like that it's more low-key and not as dominating of a structure. Quote, it looks like Portland was one quote we got from a respondent. And some respondents feel that the tied arch looks better with the asymmetry of structure only on the east side. The last piece is durability. That was also a key theme. Some respondents perceived the tied arch as more stable looking. All right, next slide. Okay, and this is the other piece I know that this committee was particularly interested in. So the tied arch, long and shorter options. When we look at that, 62% preferred the longer option of those who actually responded to this question, and nearly 38% preferred the shorter option. So we did want to note some important data here that just over 50% of those who preferred the tied arch option actually responded to this question. So 50% of the people who preferred tied arch said, nah, I don't need to say anything about the short or long. Next slide. And then here are some of the key themes for why folks chose the long or shorter versions. For long, style was a big piece of it. I like the idea of a more gradual slope. And landmark. Many noted the arch should have more presence because of the Burnside Bridge's importance in the city. One person said, Burnside deserves something grand and traditional to So these are also number one vote comparisons amongst the 3 different sub options. So let's just, sorry, one second here. So respondents preferred the V tower the most out of the 3, and then the inverted Y and goalpost. Next slide. And the reasons why folks preferred cable stay over tied arch. Respondents generally liked the look of cable stay. They said it was more modern, more dramatic. One person said, I like cable bridges. They have a cool vibe about them. It's simply more artistic. Another reason was matches the Tillicum crossing. Many respondents chose the cable stay because they like the similarity to the Tillicum crossing. And uniqueness. So despite the Tillicum crossing, many still felt that it would be unique for the area. One quote was, we have an opportunity to create a unique form and make it an icon in Portland. And then they just disliked the tied arch. Next slide. Okay, so let's now look at all 6 sub-options compared to each other. Next slide. Okay, so you can see, and I'm like too short or something here. So there's 3 that are kind of in the very close. The cable stay V tower, the braced basket handle, and then the braced vertical arch. And then cable stay, the inverted Y tower, falls after that as far as the preferences overall. Next slide. And then also just to help folks understand for the 7 different languages that we also put the survey in, these are the preferences combined. So all 7 different languages, what did they prefer? We took all of those responses. And the cable stay V tower was the most preferred, and then inverted Y tower follows, and the goalpost after that. Next slide. Okay. I think I flew through that. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. Great. Perfect.
Okay. All right. So this is a lot of data, right? You may be kind of reeling from all this information. But again, the hope is that this answers some questions for you all as you start to have these conversations, because we know the ultimate goal is to get down to one bridge type, one option. So I wanted to just start with, like, are there any surprises or anything that you wanted to just talk about what you've just heard, or just some of your initial thoughts? So we don't have to dive into all the, like, what you think and all your thoughts right now, but just some initial feelings. So I see Jason, Valerie, and Bob. Oh, yeah, sorry about that.
I just find it really interesting, the V tower as being settling out in multiple places as a top choice. I think it would be interesting if we could look into that survey data to find out why specifically people elevated that particular cable stay above the others, because that is not what I was expecting of the data.
Yeah, it's a surprise. Valerie, how about you?
Yes, I thought similarly to the last comment that it was interesting that the V tower stood out, mostly because the very first thing we saw was that people preferred the tight arch, like overall, but that it actually beat out the tight arch overall in the preferred bridge type. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Bob, I saw you next, and then Patty, and then Patrick.
Thank you. I was neglecting not also thanking Keith for his excellent presentation and the very careful way you stepped through all the different considerations, and then giving, I thought, an opinion, but also that I had your a lot of background thinking, both objective and subjective. So I appreciate that very much. I want to ask a question about, you said that we are going to make a selection. And I'm thinking to myself, that would be lovely if this group could come up with a single point of view. My
Yes.
gut feeling is that we're probably going to have multiple points of view. And my hope, in our wonderful Portland way, that if we do have multiple points of view, that those can be represented and articulated to the commissioners so that they would understand why we, if we do, that's not a presumption on my part, but I just wanted to sort of think that through a little bit, that unlike a jury or something where you've got to, make a decision, yes or no, binary, you're guilty or not guilty, we may end up with a hung jury here, meaning we may not agree. And I think also in Portland, we've got, thinking about our traditions, a lot of experience in representing both points of view, but also being able to articulate in a very careful and respectful way. So.
Yeah, great points. So I just want to say that yes, we would like you to get to one bridge option. In our charter, we have that we would like to reach consensus, which means 75% of you, which is about, if everybody's here, about 16 of you, right, agreeing on one thing. And yes, we would include both the majority opinion as well as any minority divergent opinions. So if we can't get there, we can have discussions, but that's why we have 3 meetings set aside. So you don't have to do it today, but we hope that you do it by the 15th. So I saw Patty and then Patrick.
Thank
And
you.
then Gabriel.
I wanted to make an observation about the Tie Dart Bridge over the freeway. There was an image that Keith showed last time, which really was the view from I-5. And he made the very important point that when you're on I-5, you can't actually see the river. And what you see is a Tie Dart Bridge, which is pretty much symmetrical across the freeway and the railroad. And the other image, or the pair of images that he showed, the most important ones, he said, also show that the Tie Dart Bridge doesn't really address the river at all. It's off to one side. And I think it fails for that reason. That's a fundamental thing. A friend of mine made a great comment when we were working on the Columbia River Bridge. He said, with a setting like this, it's got to be a bridge that God likes. And that's a hell of a tall order, but it's got to be something that really addresses the river. And the Tide Arch doesn't. It simply doesn't. And that may be a subjective view, but I hope it's helpful and constructive.
Great, thanks, Patty. All right, so Patrick, then Gabriel.
So I think I was encouraged, despite seeing a broad spectrum of different preferences, that when we were talking about when people wrote in what they liked about their particular type, one of the top themes between cable stayed and tied arches was uniqueness. I think that was common to people's desires, regardless of what they saw it expressed. And I'm glad that people saw that expressed in multiple options. So I think that gives us some leeway for discussion, but I think also gives us a little bit of a North Star for our discussions of people overall appreciate something that is unique to the city, and unique to this setting, unique to the Northwest, that also can set Portland apart. I think, Brian, maybe in one of our first couple of meetings, you mentioned that one of the goals for this process might be to make something that's iconic, something that really aims high with some of our aspirations. And I think from what I'm seeing from the survey results, just at first blush, I think that kind of echoes that there's a goal to make something that stands out and stands apart.
Yeah, great, thanks. Gabriel.
Just curious, during the outreach, were they only shown the static images that we're seeing here, or were the animations at the entry available, because that really changed my perspective on how it looked. An amazing job on the team that did the animations.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, definitely. Great question. Yes, the video renderings were shown on the website, and we often showed them in the briefings. I'm not sure, I'm kind of looking around. Cassie, were they shown in all the cells briefings? They weren't okay.
Shown at the briefing. We really directed people to the online open house and survey to go. That's where you want to submit. You want to look at more details. We didn't always have that much time to be going through, a few minutes of videos in addition to all the renderings. And so we mostly went through still images in the briefings and then directed them to the online open house, where each video was right there with renderings for each option.
Great. Does that clarify? Okay, perfect. Okay, Gwen.
So I wanted to thank the public outreach team. I know you worked very hard to get this information in front of a lot of different people. And I'm impressed with your survey results in terms of how many people you got to answer. I do wish we could bring those thousands of people into this conversation somehow and talk
Maybe
about
they're on
more of the
YouTube.
nuanced details.
Yeah.
And I've been through another survey process where there's like another bank of questions that people get, or like, if you knew that this was true about this particular material, or if you knew that this was true about how, if we point out this framing to you, now what do you think about these bridge types? I wonder how many opinions would change. So
Yeah. Patrick, are you still have a question? Or you don't? Sorry, not to put you on the spot. Okay. I'm wondering what data, I mean, I think that's like a good segue into my next question for you all is what data do you all need to continue this conversation? Whether it's something now, tonight, that you can ask, or something that we can come back to have answers for you next week. Are there any questions that you still have? I see Ed's maybe got a question. You got that? Okay.
I think what I was getting ready to say kind of goes along with, fits to what your question about need for data. I'm finding myself in a quandary now about the kind of the aesthetic choice and how it's influenced by the cost data that we heard tonight. I came in pretty much agreeing with everything that Keith said. My preference was the inverted Y tower. Specific reason that Keith pointed out is I think it fits better with how it fits between the high-rise buildings on the east side. I'm kind of shocked that so many people went for the other goalpost tower and the V tower because how they don't relate so well to that view you get coming from the east, coming from the west side and cross the ridge toward the east and see that inverted Y in between the buildings, like that view in the upper right-hand corner. That really appealed to me, and I think it did to Keith too. So, so I kind of came in with my mind made up, but then we saw the cost data from Emily, and I began to think, well, I mean, $30 or $40 million extra, it's a big chunk of money to throw on top of the base cost for the lower cost thing, and I'm not quite sure how to cope with that as we think about how to make a decision in this group or look for a consensus and how much we should let the cost influence us and whether we should just. So I'd be interested if anyone else has any thoughts on that idea, either from the staff, the county staff, or from the CDAG group about what influences will come to bear on our decision, aesthetic versus cost and whatever else it might be.
Yeah, great question. I saw a lot of table tents flip up at that point, Ed. So I think we'll maybe hear from your fellow members before we check in with the staff. Is that okay? Okay, but it's a good question, Ed. So I think that I saw Valerie, then Carol, then Jason, then Bob, then Gabriel. So Valerie first.
Yes, this is actually very connected to what Ed just said. As a clarification and as a reminder, because it's been a while since you walked us through the steps, like we've surveyed the public, we're making a decision as a group, and then it's going to go to another group after this. Could you remind, after we make a decision as an advisory group, who is going to look at our decision? And also, how much is cost going to influence their decision after ours?
I can take a first pass at it, and then I might pass it to county staff. So my understanding is that you all make a recommendation. Hopefully it's one option, and then staff takes that to the Board of County Commissioners. As far as how much, I think I'll pass that off.
I think I'll phone a friend on this one as well with our transportation director. So, so slightly a bit different. The decision-making process is the CDAG will be making a recommendation to the project team, and the project team makes a recommendation to the board, but also shares all the input we receive from the public and the Community Design Advisory Group. And I'd love to have John speak to this group, our transportation director, just to kind of weigh in on some of the comments we're hearing about how cost is being considered in the overall decision-making process.
Yeah, great question.
So can you repeat the question, just so that I make sure that I answer?
Valerie, yeah.
My question was, after we as an advisory group make a decision and it goes to the Board of Commissioners, how much is cost going to influence the decision at that point?
So essentially not at all at that point. So if you come up with a decision, if you agree on a singular decision, we will take that decision to the County Board of Commissioners. We expect that they will accept our decision, and that's what we will move forward with on the project. We'll take that along with the other decisions that we're making about the rest of the bridge. We'll move forward with design into 30% design. We'll price all that out with our contractor in January. We'll kind of run that through a risk scenario in the spring, and then we'll have a pretty good idea of what all that will cost in the kind of springtime. The value of that, the whole bridge package as we've envisioned it at that point. And we'll start to think about, is that acceptable at that point? Are there things that we need to change? Do we need to do anything to reduce the cost at that point? But that's when we'll have our first idea of what this whole thing really costs. Because right now, we don't have a great handle on that because we haven't decided exactly what we're going to build yet. Does that help? Okay, great.
Great, thank you so much, John. Okay, so I am pretty sure that I saw Carol next.
Oh, thank you. In one of our meetings, we talked about the columns or the bridge bents on the east side of the bridge and where they would be located. And I think one was the short bridge was adjacent to railroad property, and then I'm not recalling where the longer design went. But I was wondering if the location of those columns or the acquisition of either easements or right-of-way to get those designs in place, do they affect in any way the designs that we're talking about? In other words, do those column locations affect the design?
Is that Megan or Steve or someone? Not me.
Yeah, so the question is really, is there a distinction between the short or long tide arch, or even frankly the cable stay, with respect to right-of-way acquisition? The simple answer is not really. There's some very subtle differences between the widths of the bridge because you have these towers versus not having the towers, but effectively it's the same type of impact overall, and we're just talking about slivers of differences. Yep.
So Carol was asking if there was any impact to the to the railroad. right?
Right. So in terms of all of the options are supported some distance east of the railroad and some distance west of 2nd Avenue. So within that stretch, there's a few different locations where the column can come down. On the short version, it's closer to the railroad. For the tied arch, the longer tied arch is closer to 2nd, and right in between the two is where the cable stay is. So it's within that stretch between the railroad and 2nd, and that's one of the parameters that we're using across the board.
Okay, so I saw Jason next. And then Bob.
So like Ed, I came into this session with pretty clear ideas of what I liked in terms of the inverted Y, and interestingly enough, secondary, the end-braced vertical arch, which when we look at the cost range ends up being our two highest ends of the spectrum. So that's part of the reason why I was asking about the context of where this delta falls to the larger number. And Keith, it was very encouraging in talking about the fact that we may be able to manage some of that cost on the high end by the shaping and contouring, with the inverted Y potentially needing a little bit less of that in its own signature way than potentially goalpost towers others might need. So I'm assuming that we would be able to send a recommendation that would have some potential variability there in terms of how much of that delta actually gets used. But I also want to just note that there's quite a bit of a difference between the cost and the range of that delta. And so I think this all being within the purview of the budget, the cost is important, and I agree with that we need to take that into consideration, but it doesn't seem like it's the most important factor. And then in terms of the question on whether we could get more data on the V tower preference in the survey, I think that could be really helpful because the V tower and the inverted Y were both in close proximity to each other in terms of public input. Comments could be really helpful to see, do some of the comments on the preference for the V tower actually potentially also support the case for the inverted Y? And just given the fact that that was such a strong preference in public input, it would give us a lot more argument if we were moving forward with something that was not necessarily the front line winner of public input. Not that that should necessarily be our key criteria.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Oh, sure. Do you want to come up here? Yeah.
Yeah, just very quickly in response to that. You see, my gut or my experience tells me, without being able to articulate exactly why, the V tower won't be as successful as the images tell you that it is. See, I was quite surprised because you look at it and I can see why there was a preference, because I think, well, I won't say that we overserved the V tower, but I think we underserved the inverted Y, and that it's very difficult if you're looking at these things and say, well, I like that one and I don't like that one, because the images tell you what you like, right? So I think despite that, I think my preference comes despite what the images tell you, and I suspect there's probably a great deal of that has gone on, that people are speaking with their eyes.
Great, thanks. Is that okay? So Bob, and then it'll be Gabriel.
Just offering some perspective, and I'm trying very hard not to come off as that I know more than I'm really going to talk about. But I was thinking back when we were looking at costs for the project, and my experience having worked at TriMet and public works projects for 30 years, and the pressure that we're always under to deliver a project for the budget is enormous, and it's really important. And I think that's why the county has put together their process this way, to have both expertise, looking at the numbers, trying to look in the crystal ball, as far as you can, with the information that you have, knowing that there's still risk factors out there. But baked into their process is managing those risks in a really responsible way. And so when we see numbers here, we're probably, as committee members, I'm presuming, thinking about costs. And what I want us to also put into our thought process is investment. And I'm thinking that we're doing something that's going to, you pick the number, 100 years, 125 years, and you look at the delta numbers and you do the math, you go, well, that's an incremental bump over the lifespan of the project. And and this is not meant to be an excuse, but we're looking forward, but we also look back. We think about the history and we think about the city. And we also have to recognize that there are forward-thinking folks in this community 100 and some years ago who recognized that they were going to be paying for something far beyond what the cost was because they recognized that they were making an investment. And this project is an investment. We're not building a bridge for today, we're building a bridge for the future. And so in coming up with our decision, I want us to be mindful that there's always that public reaction. Oh, why did they pick the most expensive thing? Or why didn't they pick the thing that's going to have the greater value over time? That's today's comments that we'll hear. What we won't hear is my grandson's life thinking about this project and his children's thinking about this project. What I want them to think about is not what the cost of it was. What I want them to think about and remember was the investment that my grandparents made for the future, for my life, and for my community going forward.
Great, thank you. Okay, Gabriel. And then Brian, and then Susan.
So my comment was on cost as well. And the $50 million number, it's a huge number, but it's 5% of the project. I think 10 or 15% should be our kind of scale. That's how much it's going to increase if we were lucky over the process of building this bridge. So I really don't think we should look at cost much at all. It's just not a big enough variable for this project. We need to design something that's, what the city needs, not just trying to be cheap.
Great, thanks, Gabriel. All right, so Brian, and then Susan, and then Aaron.
Hi. My question is not about cost. It's more directed at Keith, since we have the designer here.
Mm-hmm.
With the cable-stayed bridge, in your presentation, you mentioned that the tide arch and the lighting wasn't going to be as, or it doesn't, it doesn't allow itself to be lit up as conveniently, or maybe illuminate the bridge as well as, say, the cable stayed. And I was curious if you could shed some ideas or maybe share some of the thoughts you might have on the cable stayed lighting at night, and because I think with the scale of a tide arch and the towers being so tall, it's going to be a true beacon in the city. But I'm curious where the designer's thoughts lie on this.
Well, first up, I'm not the lighting designer, right? But I have designed lots of lighting on lots of bridges. And one of the great things about darkness is that you can change the focus, the visual focus. So you could say, well, actually, the thing we want to light is that horizontal line. I mean, bridges are very simple and elemental. You have a horizontal line, which is the deck, and you have either a vertical or a curved line, which is the arch or the tower. So you can choose which elements you're trying to highlight. But with a cable stay, yes, you can illuminate the whole array of cables, or you can't. I mean, I think there's a big debate about this because, I don't own an apartment in the yard yet, but it's in and amongst where people live, and I think there are considerations of it. But you have a lighting program, and whilst I don't think what has been done on the Morrison is the greatest thing ever, but I think that it kind of sets the agenda for saying, well, actually, forget about the East Bridge. What you've got is two kind of pieces of floating joy in the river, and maybe that's where you should be concentrating. So I think there's a whole bunch of decisions and discussions that will happen in the fullness of time. But my comment about the arch, was directed at weathering steel to say, it's a minor point, but illuminating a weathering steel arch is going to give somebody else a headache. Thankfully, somebody else.
Okay, does that answer your question? Okay, so Susan?
Well, first of all, I think that cost does matter. So I'll just start with that. And second of all, call me common, but I think I'd like to point out before we throw the tiered arch under the bridge, so to speak, which seems to be happening pretty rapidly, that 54% of the public actually preferred it. And most of the people that I spoke with informally preferred it. They thought in particular the inverted Y that Keith prefers was like taking a two-pronged fork and jabbing it into the east side with a very long, ugly concrete tower. So I guess it's kind of a lot about your own perspective. 75% is consensus. Maybe that's an agreed upon thing, but where I come from, consensus is consensus, not 75%. That just sounds like a supermajority. The other thing I'd like to point out is that I felt a little bit gaslit by the comment about that everybody prefers a tiered arch as though it's something in my DNA or something, and that therefore, if people prefer that, it's because there's something in you, in your chromosomes that prefer it, and therefore it should be discounted, rather than actually maybe respected that people do prefer a tiered arch, and that 54% of the people did prefer a tiered arch. The other thing I'd like to point out is the perspective that talking about photobombing of the end of the arch into the river was taken from the middle of the river. I mean, most of the time that I'll be looking at the bridge, I'll be either on one side of the river or the other side of the river, or on the bridge itself. I won't be in the middle of the river. That would be a very rare opportunity that I would ever be in the middle of the river looking at it, being photobombed. And actually, I have much more of a sense of the inverted cable stay as being more of a photobomb. So I really think it has a lot to do with perspective, and I would like to encourage this group to not rush to a conclusion and not just take, even if people are experts, and I respect people's expert opinion, to also understand that maybe a lot of people don't believe that a tiered arch is just wrong for this site. That maybe people are thinking that what we're doing with the public is asking them to spend an enormous amount of money and an enormous amount of time getting rid of a historic landmark and replacing it with a bridge that won't fall down during an earthquake. That's our goal. That's our number one goal, the resilience and the strength of the bridge. And so I'm concerned about it morphing into that we're trying to make this iconic statement with this very large tower on the east side, because I don't remember that being the goal that I had going into this process many, many years ago. My investment in my time and in my community was to make sure that we had something powerfully strong to survive this enormous earthquake, and that we would be able to use it, and at the same time would be pleasing to the eye. Okay, so let's be open to the fact that different people have different perspectives as to what is pleasing. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Susan. All right, I see Aaron, and then I just want to check one more time if there are other data needs. So I think just Aaron here in the middle. Oh, I'm not sure if yours works.
Let's find out. It does. I just wanted to say, it's not so much a question, I guess, just me sort of processing a little bit what we went through or heard tonight. And I guess first I wanted to say thank you to Keith for the very interesting and useful presentation. You know, I was admittedly a little worried that he had some insight into the outcome of the survey when he was mentioning the 3-to-1 typical preference, which I admit, coming into this, my preference is more for the cable stay. So I was a little nervous that we were going to find out that it was a 75% preference for one that I maybe would not tend to be as interested in. But as Susan said, it really was almost evenly split, which I think is encouraging. That the results are so close, and so to me, I think that opens up the possibility of having, I think, a strong conversation to discuss the merits and the downfalls of both of those options, and that I'm happy that we're not necessarily in a position where we would feel overly pressured to rule one of them out. And I think from there, then I think it becomes a difference in degree, right? And starting to talk about the differences between, say, the inverted Y and the V tower and the goalpost, for instance, on one hand, seems like less of a wide gulf, right? We're really just talking about difference of degree at that point. And I think I was, you know, sort of regretting earlier on after listening to Keith's presentation that that some of that insight couldn't be embedded into the survey that we sent out. Because I think there was some really interesting insights about constructability, about its relationship to urban context, materiality, lighting, all those things that I think are really important and I don't think are really conveyed as useful as the images, and I appreciate all the videos especially, but it does become a somewhat superficial response to a specific set of images. And I think what we heard tonight was a much greater level of depth about the kind of considerations I think we should all be taking into account as we're making our final decision. So I guess as was said earlier, I appreciate the feedback from the expert. And I also appreciate the input from the public, but we're not necessarily working off the same set of data anymore. I mean, even looking at the images that are on the screen right now, we can see, for instance, the absence of the, whatever we're calling them, the worker towers above the
operator towers.
The operator towers, thank you very much. I think it has a big impact on what we see, how we take in all the parts and how they work together. And so I just want to point out that we're moving forward beyond what the information that was available to the public. And I think we should, work with that in mind.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah, great points. I kind of want to see if, we're getting into the end of our time together today. I know that, yes, like I think, Aaron, what you were just saying about your job as the CDAG is to kind of take all this data, right? You're hearing different things from the public, right? And this is all meant to help you make a recommendation. And so, one question I have is, based on what you're hearing tonight, and it may be too soon, and but is there something that you think we should not bring back into the conversation next Thursday, right? So is there one option or two options or more, whatever, that you feel like you're ready to pull off from conversation? And I think I'm seeing some people like, oh, a little hesitant about that. But I just want to check because I think it's going to be hard going forward, right? And all of it's going to feel a little bit difficult. I don't want to rush you in this decision, but I also just want to take a temperature check and see kind of where you're at. Do you, maybe just a show of hands, do you feel like there could be a conversation tonight about removing an option, let's say? Do you think you could remove an option tonight? Okay, I'm seeing about half of you saying that you'd be comfortable with that conversation. So, I think we heard from the public and we heard, there's cost, public, professional opinion. I think what I'm hearing that is kind of on the lower side, and I'm just going to throw this out here as a proposal, is that braced vertical arch. Am I saying that right? The right one. So the girdle, which I giggled about. So I think that was expensive. No, maybe I'm wrong. Okay, not expensive, but lower in the public opinion and lower in the architect's opinion. So then we also heard, I don't know. So I'm just like throwing that out there as an idea. If, I just want to check in with you all. Is there something that someone is like, I get that off the table? Gabriel.
What was the public opinion on the unbraced vertical arches? Because that was the most expensive design. And I don't know if anybody has a real hankering that that's the bridge of the future, but it seems like a prime suspect to just cut out.
Brenda, do you know, or?
So the unbraced vertical arch, I think, was second choice for those that chose the tied arch as their preferred bridge type.
Okay.
I think in the list of 6, and I don't know if we have that
Twin,
presentation.
do you think we can go to
they came in
the
third.
different, the top of all
I don't have the
surveys?
presentation in front of me because we didn't have time to print it.
Yeah, they were super, it technically was second, but they were like super close, within like 50.
Okay. Of which two?
The braced basket handle and the unbraced vertical arch.
Oh, okay, so those T1 and T2.
Well,
yeah. Okay.
I think that's, yeah.
There
I think
we
that's
go.
the slide we need right
Yeah,
there.
That's the
thank you,
slide.
Twin.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's that 3206 one right there, the unbraced vertical arch. So technically
Was-
third overall among all bridge type selections.
Mm-hmm. So the braced vertical arch was the second to the lowest. That was, and I think the goalpost and the braced vertical arch were the least expensive. They were the Delta, and one other, right, Emily?
Yeah, the basket handle, the braced basket handle.
Okay, which is the second preference. I think that's okay, Twin. I think that's okay. So, okay, so with that, you all are leading this conversation. I'll push you as we get closer and our time gets more constrained. But I just want to check in because that was one that was the braced vertical arch was lower preference, but also less expensive. Valerie. And then Susan.
I guess the one that you brought up was not one I was thinking at all about taking off the table.
Okay.
I was thinking, which is what we can see on the screen, the goalpost tower, because I haven't heard anything tonight that says that it is somebody's top option. I mean, if somebody wants to correct that, feel free, but I haven't heard anything yet.
Yeah. Great, thanks. Susan. And then Patty. and then Patrick.
Yeah, I just, again, when we were looking at this before, with the cable stay V tower getting supposedly the most votes, but the two tiered arch are almost, I mean, they're very similar in design, and they got 6,400 votes overall, whereas more people like the V tower than the inverted Y, which got 5,500 votes. So again, I'm just sort of pointing out where the public was heading.
Mhm.
But if you're trying to narrow, I would agree. I haven't heard a whole lot of people clamoring about the gold post cable stay. So, you know, that might be one to knock off. I'm going to pass this to Patty because he's
Okay,
next.
yeah, pass it to Patty.
Thank you. No, I was just going to suggest that since we have only 6 options, we keep all of them until the discussion next week, because really it's a 2-stage thing. I mean, is it tied arch or is it cable stay? And then which subset of that is it? And I'm not sure it's going to help that conversation to have any of them out at the moment. And I'd add to the comment that Gabriel made that, you know, the difference in cost at this stage, I mean, given how approximate it is de minimis. I think we should take care, of course, of costs, but not yet, because we don't know enough. There are huge approximations at this stage. So let's look at the effect of the bridge as the number one thing.
Patrick, you're fine? Okay. Okay, well, I heard a proposal to keep all 6, and then I also heard a proposal to maybe get rid of the goalpost. So I'm going to just have a simple raise your hand for which one of those 2 options would you prefer. Either, so we'll ask keep all 6 or take goalpost off the table, okay? Does that make sense between, yeah, Ian?
Not to confuse the issue, I would also propose getting rid of the tide brace arch. Both of them received, unfortunately, they are among the cheapest to make, but I think since we have been assured by the county that all of these fall within perfectly acceptable range of expenditure, that I'm not super concerned about that at this point. And I think going from 6 to 4, it's a good even number. But they also both of those bridge types also got the least friendly response from the public.
Okay, yeah. So I heard also look at removal of the braced vertical arch, the TA3, and then Aaron, right? TA3?
TA3 and CS1?
Yeah.
I just wanted to second that recommendation.
Okay. So let's just have a vote on removal of the goalpost tower from discussion moving forward. So that is the CS1 goalpost tower. So if you would like to remove that from further conversation, and then we'll talk about the braced arch. You want, I know. So I just want to take it in stages in case people. So, okay, so raise your hand if you're done talking about the goalpost tower, and you would like to just take that off the table now from further conversation. So I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. How many people do we have today? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 out of 14. So to me, that is more than 75%. Are you mathing me? Are you checking my math? Because I am not a math person. So I'm hearing that that's more than 75%. So 10 out of 14. Oh, it's not 70. Oh, okay. You need a half of person. Okay. So, so we will keep that until next Thursday. We can vote again, which we will, I'm sure, many times. All right. So let's talk about the tide braced arch, the TA3 braced vertical arches. So if we're good moving that off the table and not talking about that anymore, TA3 braced vertical arches, if you're wanting to not talk about that anymore, then raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay. So to me, that means that one is off the table. So TA3 braced vertical arch is off the table. So we're down to 5. And so we will be lopsided in our images next week, but I think that's great. We're making progress. So it'll be lots of hard conversations moving forward. I want to make sure that we get you out of here on time. So we will be back. I just want to verify, no comments, right? No public comments. Okay. And then we'll be back in this room next Thursday. Oh, Susan, you have your card up. Okay.
Well, after seeing that second vote, I'm prepared to change my vote on the first vote.
Oh, okay.
Which would give us 11. I don't know, I'd be more than a half.
Okay. All right. Susan's, okay, well, okay. She's willing to barter.
I'm a
people.
gambler. I'm a
All
barter.
right. Okay. Okay, well, let's do a full show of hands then. People who don't want to talk about the goalpost, CS1 goalpost. So raise your hand if you don't want to talk about it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Wow. All right. Okay, that's off the table. We're back to even numbers, people. Good job. All right, so we're back here next week for more gambling, and I think we'll have a good time. I know Twin has picked out fabulous food for us next week as well. Yeah, Bob.
Then the videos, the updated videos we're seeing earlier.
Oh yeah,
tonight.
here.
The videos are available on the website, yes?
It will be. The renderings. Okay, so the videos are still, the renderings are still up on the website, but the survey is down, so you can no longer comment on the survey. Okay, thank you. So we'll be back here next week, same bat time, same bat location, and so please bring your A games, and we're gonna duke it out. I don't know, any more metaphors? So, and then if we need it, we'll be here again on the 15th, but who knows? Susan's gambling, so we might be quick about it. All right, thank you everyone. Really appreciate your time, and we're done 3 minutes early. So good work, everyone. Good job. Thank you.